In 2019, footage of a US Coast Guard interdiction of a homemade drug smuggling submarine took the world by storm, and for good reason. As we watched one of the baddest dudes we're likely ever to see outside of a movie pounding on the hatch of a mostly submerged sub, many of us were shocked to learn that drug cartels actually have their own submarines at all. But what may surprise you even more is that these amateur submarines were really something of a consolation prize for drug smugglers out of Colombia. Their first choice? An actual Soviet Foxtrot-Class submarine. And what's even crazier is that the Russians seemed more than happy to sell them one. Let's talk about how Colombia's drug cartels almost got their hands on a Soviet submarine. I'm Alex Hollings, and it's about time we talked about some sea power. The Cold War that erupted between the United States and Soviet Union immediately after World War II prompted a massive buildup of military hardware in both nations. The Soviets, championing their communist political and economic model, secured a number of early public relations victories over the capitalist United States, being the first nation to send a satellite, a dog, and a person into space. This early lead created what some have taken to calling the Sputnik crisis in America. The Soviets weren't just matching the technological might of the world's first nuclear power, they were exceeding it and showing the world just how effective their government model could be. For the United States and its allies, dead set on preventing the spread of communism, these technological successes were seen as a clear and present danger to the Western way of life, prompting a flood of funding into a wide variety of programs, all aimed at directly competing with the new Soviet juggernaut. Those early Soviet wins led directly to the establishment of NASA and the reorienting of famed former Nazi scientist Wernher von Braun away from the Redstone missiles he was tasked with building and toward the heavens. Von Braun's work led to the development of the Saturn V rocket, a platform that took America to the moon and remains among the most powerful spacecraft ever constructed. America's eventual victory in the space race can be seen as indicative of America's broad approach to battling the Soviets on technological and financial grounds. In fact, many credit President Ronald Reagan with effectively spending the Soviets into ruin, fielding increasingly capable military platforms and weapons, which forced the Soviets to respond in kind, despite their struggling economy. Of course, the way the Soviet government prioritized military spending to maintain its ability to exercise diplomatic intimidation was one of the factors that led to the Soviet Union's collapse, though, to be clear, that was just one of them. There are multiple factors that can be attributed to the fall of the Soviet Union, including the will of its populace, but it's tough to discount the dire financial straits the former superpower found itself in by 1991, the year the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and a new Russian government took its place. It was during this transitional time that the new Russia gained a reputation for offloading military hardware to the highest bidder, regardless of who that bidder may be. The new Russian state lacked the funds needed to operate or maintain its massive military apparatus, or even to sufficiently pay large swaths of its personnel. As a result, military officials participated in the sale of military assets as a means to survive amid the nation's absolute economic collapse. In one instance, the Russian government even tried to trade the American soft drink company Pepsi a fleet of warships and submarines in exchange for a new shipment of soda, though it's important to note that those ships were not in a functional state and were really just scrap metal by that point. But when Russian Navy officials conspired to sell a diesel-electric submarine to drug cartels in Colombia, that was not for scrap metal. The use of these submarines could allow the cartel to smuggle as much as 40 tons of into the United States with each trip. And as you might imagine, that would be a very lucrative enterprise, making these Colombian drug cartels among the few non-national government organizations that could afford to buy a submarine from Russia. But to tell that story right, we need to jump back to before the fall of the Soviet Union, to 1980, when a Soviet man named Ludwig Fainberg arrived in Miami with his sights set on the American dream. He quickly found work as an enforcer for the Gambino crime family, doing just the sort of work we've come to expect from Russians with mob connections, mostly beating money out of people. And Fainberg was good at what he did. Before long, he had earned the nickname Tarzan and even made enough money to open his own strip club near the Miami airport that he named Porky's, after the sexploitation flick of the same name, which was allegedly filmed in the same building. And it probably won't shock you to learn that it wasn't long before the strip club owned by a Russian with mob ties became the hangout of choice for members of Russia's own organized crime community who were operating within the opulence of 1980s Miami. As the years pressed on, Tarzan's crime connections and booming business helped him meet all sorts of powerful and influential figures from both sides of the law. 90s rapper Vanilla Ice was one of his friends, and it was actually Mr. Ice himself who first introduced Tarzan to the man who would become his partner in crime, Juan Almeida. Almeida was a prominent businessman and a crook who dealt in high-end boats and exotic cars. And before long, Tarzan and Almeida were in business together, flying in and out of now post-collapse Russia and purchasing everything from motorcycles to helicopters for pennies on the American dollar, which they would then sell to customers for a tidy profit. Before long, the exploits of Tarzan and Almeida would lead them into a business-based friendship with a man who would later be the star of his very own episode of America's Most Wanted, Nelson Tony Yester. Yester had strong ties with the Medellin drug cartel run by none other than Pablo Escobar. By all accounts, Yester was a serious criminal, more serious than the somewhat jovial and notably less murderous Tarzan and Almeida. Nonetheless, Tarzan and his new drug contact became fast friends, and that friendship turned highly profitable after Tarzan and Almeida brokered a deal with Escobar's cartel through Yester to purchase 2 heavy payload Russian Kamov helicopters, intended to transport drugs throughout Colombia. That deal led to even deeper ties with Yester as a connection to Escobar, as the Russian mafia weren't going to allow these helicopters to leave without getting a cut of the deal. So in a turn of events that sound more like a movie than real life, Almeida flew back to Moscow pretending to be Pablo Escobar and managed to broker another deal for drug distribution with the Russian mob inside the newly minted Russian state. Having proven their value to the cartel, Tarzan and Almeida became their go-between of choice for sourcing Russian hardware. But their next job sounded crazy even to these two men who had managed to charter a military cargo aircraft to smuggle their ill-gotten helicopters to Colombia. You see, a part of Escobar's cartel, known as the Cali cartel, had split from his organization and rapidly became a significant player in the drug business. They wanted a better way to smuggle drugs into the United States, so they approached Yester to see if his new friends could purchase a working Soviet Navy submarine for the job. Yester, just shooting from the hip, told him it would cost $50 million, a figure that did give the Cali cartel pause. That is, until Yester told them that the submarine could ship about $40 million worth of in each trip. For the cartel, that seemed like an investment that was worth the risk. Once he was given the green light from his sources within the Cali cartel, Yester contacted Tarzan to have him reach out to his connections in Russia. According to Tarzan's statements, he reached out to inquire, but was told that it would take a few days to find out for sure. And crazy as it might sound, just 2 days later, Tarzan got the call. In a 2018 documentary about this ordeal called Operation Odessa, Tarzan recalled his contact asking just one question: do you want the submarine with missiles or without? Just like that, the ball was rolling to equip Escobar's former drug cartel with their own military submarine. Now, diesel-electric submarines are easier to spot than the nuclear variety employed by the United States Navy, thanks in no small part to the fact that they often need to surface, where their loud engines and their vented diesel exhaust can be pretty easy to spot. But when these submarines are submerged, they don't actually run on diesel. The props that give the submarine's propulsion are run by electric motors powered by batteries that are recharged by the diesel engines while on the surface. As a result, even diesel subs are are incredibly tough to spot while operating underwater. In fact, in a series of war games held in 2005, the massive USS Ronald Reagan, a Nimitz-class supercarrier, was sunk repeatedly by a Swedish diesel-electric submarine that managed to sneak past the entire carrier strike group's defenses. The Russian sub in question was a diesel-electric Foxtrot-Class, which had been in service since the 1950s. At 300 feet long, the sub had space to spare for all the drugs the Cali cartel could want, as well as 10 torpedo tubes in case things got dicey under the sea. Now, it goes without saying that a vessel of that size could come in really handy for a drug cartel looking for a way to transport large amounts of cocaine into Miami, which is a well-known distribution hub for drugs smuggled in from South and Central America. That is, if it ever reached the cartel's hands. Tarzan and Almeida flew to Russia, where, to their absolute surprise, they were able to meet directly with a number of high-ranking officials from the Russian Navy, who took them to one of their secret submarine installations to tour a sub similar to the one they were offering to sell. While the facility was a secret and the pending purchase would have been seen as highly illegal by just about every nation on the planet, Tarzan and Almeida felt they would not be able to secure the funds without proof that there really was a submarine on the other end of the deal. So they asked if they could take pictures with the submarines for proof, but the Russians refused to permit that for pretty obvious reasons. But we are talking about mid-90s Russia, and Tarzan offered one of the Russian officials $200 American to change his mind, and that was enough. With money in hand, the Russian officer not only changed his tune, but even posed in pictures with the duo with the submarines in the background. Tarzan and Almeida had done their job. Now they just needed Yester and his cartel connections to do theirs. But Tarzan had yet another surprise in store because, according to his claims, the Russians even offered to sell them a nuclear weapon. After all, if they could come up with tens of millions of dollars for a submarine, they could probably come up with more for a nuke. But what Tarzan didn't know is that he had actually been under federal surveillance for months by this time. They had even managed to introduce a mole into Tarzan's circle of friends and his co-conspirators, and it was that mole who first spotted the pictures of Tarzan posing in front of that Russian sub left out carelessly on his desk. That same mole even gifted Tarzan a phone he claimed had been jailbroken to allow for free international calls, so Tarzan wouldn't have a paper trail reflecting his frequent contacts with Russian sources. Of course, the phone wasn't actually jailbroken, it was bugged, resulting in thousands of hours of conversations for law enforcement to pore through. That betrayal of Tarzan's trust, however, would not be the last. Yester, who had told the Cali cartel that they could pay for the submarine in bi-weekly payments of $10 million each, also had plans of his own. When the first shipment of money arrived in Europe for Yester to funnel to Moscow, he just didn't. Instead, he hid that $10 million in a friend's home and then paid that friend $10,000 to make himself scarce. Before long, the Cali cartel was in Miami looking for Yester and their money. Of course, Tarzan and Almeida had no idea. Their side of the deal was done, and besides, Yester had a habit of uprooting frequently, never living in any one country for too long at a time. Ultimately, Tarzan, Almeida, and Yester all managed to avoid doing any hard time for the drug submarine deal, though both Tarzan and Yester would ultimately find their way into prison for other crimes down the road. Almeida was convicted of charges stemming from his dealings with the cartel and the Russians, based largely on Tarzan's own testimony, but Tarzan later recanted that testimony, resulting in Almeida going free. If you want to learn more about this story and hear about it from Tarzan's point of view, about 6 years ago, Showtime premiered a documentary about the whole ordeal entitled Operation Odessa. I'm pretty sure you can find it streaming today on Paramount+. And that will do it for this edition of Sea Power. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.